Hi everybody, I'm back with a brand new design for my concrete garden bed panels, and they've got curves. I have three new concrete molds that have curved ends and a rounded inset. I have a 24-inch and a 36-inch length with curves on each end. Plus, I have a 36-inch long transition mold that casts a panel with one round end and a square end like my original design. The transition mold allows you to link the new curved end panels to the square end original ones to make longer beds. Here's some of the new raised garden bed configurations that can be assembled with this new design. The simplest is four 24-inch panels in a square. Here's two 24s and two 36s. Or four 36-inch panels in a bigger square. To make a longer bed, you can use two 36-inch round ends with four of the transition panels. Then, with the addition of my original panels, this bed can be made even bigger. Here I've added two of the 36-inch originals. And they can be stacked to make deeper beds. Casting these new panels is done almost identically to my original design. Since I introduced these ABS plastic molds, I've made some changes and improvements to the process to give even better results, and I'll focus more on those here. I will still go through all of the steps in case you're new to my channel and haven't seen these concrete raised beds before. Using regular Portland-based concrete mix, the 36-inch panels weigh around 50 pounds. The 24-inch ones weigh around 33 pounds. So you'll need a stable, strong work table or bench that can support the weight of the number of panels you want to pour at a time. My bench is made with 4x4 legs, 2x6 apron and stringers, and a 1-inch thick plywood top. It's also on wheels so I can move it around my shop. It's crucial that your workbench be level side to side and lengthwise. If not, then you won't have uniform concrete thickness in your mold. A spirit level and some wooden shims will be needed to ensure your workspace is level. Ambient room temperature is important in predicting how fast or slow your concrete will solidify and cure. For predictable results, I like to pour between 70 and 80 degrees. So a stretch of consistent warm weather or a heated or cooled shop or garage is required. The newly poured concrete will need to sit undisturbed for a few days, so your work area has to be away from other activities. You don't want to move your molds unless you really need to. Moving them risks cracking the new concrete. Be sure to have all your tools and supplies at the ready before you start any casting. Here's a detailed list of everything I use for pouring. My safety gear includes glasses, gloves, and a P100 respirator or dust mask. Concrete dust and wet concrete is corrosive, so always wear your safety gear. For mixing, I use a wheelbarrow, shovel, small trowel, high-strength concrete mix, cold clean water, and a pail. This wheelbarrow has seen some heavy use. To settle the mix, I use a rubber mallet and sometimes a reciprocating saw without a blade. I also have a written detailed description of this process you can download and print from my website. See the link in the description or go to manabouttools.com/casting. All right, on to making the new panels. The molds and pipes will need to be prepped before pouring concrete. Tools and supplies include wire cutters, pliers, a tape measure, small bolt cutters, galvanized wire grid, and a short length of 1-inch diameter pipe or dowel. I like the cutters on the fencing pliers that I've shown here. This is to make the coil of wire that wraps around the pipes, plus the grid that strengthens the concrete panel along its length. You may choose not to add these, but it doesn't cost much or take any significant time to add a little extra insurance, so I like to do it. To help release the concrete casting, I apply a finishing wax to the plastic mold and petroleum jelly to the pipes. I use paper towel or a cloth to apply the wax and a small brush to apply the petroleum jelly. The wax seems to give a nice smooth finish to the castings, and the petroleum jelly really makes pulling the pipes easier. After pouring, you'll need some plastic sheets and a spray bottle. Thick, clear plastic vapor barrier works well and lasts a long time. There's a few more items that will be needed after the concrete cures, and I'll cover that later when we get to that part. I use a galvanized 12-gauge fencing wire that I first cut into 24-inch lengths. With a 1-inch diameter pipe or dowel, I make 3 or 4 wraps. I take the last wrap halfway past the first, then wind it back to open up the coil so the ends are roughly parallel to each other. Then with pliers, I bend the ends over into a small loop. That step is more for safety as the ends can be sharp. I use a 4-gauge galvanized 6x6 or 4x4 wire grid for reinforcement. For panels that are 2.5 inches thick like these ones, it's recommended that any wire embedded inside not exceed that thickness. This grid can be bought at building supply or agricultural and feed stores. Sometimes it's sold as hog panel. That thickness can be hard to cut, so I use small bolt cutters. I cut it small enough that it sits an inch or so away from any edge. With the wire coils and grid cut, I now wax the mold and oil the pipes. I apply a thin and even coat of wax to all inside surfaces. I let that dry for 10 minutes or so, then wipe away the dried haze with a clean cloth or towel. I turn the cloth often and rub it until I get a high gloss shine. With a brush, I apply a generous coat of petroleum jelly to the pipe. I'm using Vaseline brand petroleum jelly here, but any generic one is fine. I hold the pipe by the end with the small hole. Now I can insert the pipe into the mold while threading the coil. I want the end with the hole to stick out past the flange edge of the mold. And now the mold is ready for concrete. With my garden hose lying in the sun, the water in the hose is getting hot. I want to only use cold water as it gives me more working time before the concrete starts to set up. So I run the hose into the garden for a few minutes until it turns cold, then I add cold water to a pail in the shade. I'll add a few gallons here to be sure I have enough. For all my casting, I am now using this 6000 psi high-strength blend. I like the brand from Quikrete. They make a 5000 psi and a 6000 psi. One or the other may not be available in all areas and countries, so you might need to shop around. I have the 6000 psi version here where I am, but I'm sure the 5000 psi one will give good results. I'm not sponsored by Quikrete, by the way. It's just what I have available where I am. For small batches, I find a wheelbarrow and shovel is adequate to mix the concrete with. I can keep the dust outside, then wheel the mix inside when ready. The 36-inch mold requires about 50 pounds of concrete. This bag holds 55 pounds of dry mix, so when I pour it into a wheelbarrow, I'll hold some back. And I do this for 2 reasons. 1, I don't need that much for this pour. 2, I always hold some back in case I accidentally add too much water to the mix. With some extra dry mix at the ready, I can thicken it again. There will be water amount recommendations on the bag of concrete mix, but I don't go by those. Ideally, I want a blend that is completely wet, but not so wet that it settles like water in the wheelbarrow. I want a mix that is fully wet and smooth to blend, but holds its shape, that holds peaks when folded with the shovel, and this may take some practice. Also, I believe these high-strength blends have a water reducer as an additive. The mix has a certain smell that's similar to some dry water reducers or plasticizers that I've used in the past. So I find that when you add water, the mix can quickly go from appearing too dry and somewhat crumbly to fully wet and smooth. Now this is a good example of that because I didn't add any more water to this mix, I just kept blending it. Now I'm not saying you can't follow the instructions on the bag, and that might be helpful when you're new to concrete mixing, but I've often found they suggest too much water. With this mix just right, I can now head in and fill the mold. I have the wire coils rotated upwards and check that the small hole end of the pipes are past the flange edge of the mold. With a small trowel, I'll add some concrete mix around the coils and pipes. This ensures that I don't have any air gaps in this area, plus I can then make sure that the wire coil is center positioned and held away from the walls of the mold. Now I'll add about 3 shovels of concrete mix to the cavity. With the small trowel, I'll push the concrete into the corners and spread it out some. I'm looking to have the mold around half full. I can settle the mix and bring bubbles to the surface by tapping the bench with a rubber mallet. You can also get excellent results by settling with some vibration. Here I'm using the recip saw without a blade. Now I'll rotate the wires down and press the ends into the mix. I'll place the wire grid in the center of the space and gently press it to keep it in place. More concrete is shoveled in and spread around. Ideally, I want the mold very slightly underfilled. I sometimes have to remove a bit or add a bit to achieve this. Myself, I usually end up with it filled to the top, and that's okay. Overfilling can lead it to spilling over on the bench or ending up with a panel that's too thick, and then it won't fit as well with other panels in the garden. And then this is settled with more vibration. If your mix was too wet, you may begin to see water pooling on the surface. If so, just leave it as it is. It should evaporate over time. A little troweling on top is done to smooth the surface. Now just leave it be for a few hours until it solidifies. At 70 degrees, this should be around 6 to 8 hours. I find there's usually some wet concrete mix left over from the pour. I take this leftover and shovel it into a plastic pail or wastebasket. I then have a piece of galvanized wire bent to fashion a handle. On the right, you can see a weight from a previous pour. I embed the wire handle in the concrete once it's settled. After a few days, I can pop this weight out of the pail. I use these around our property for weighing down sheet metal that's covering firewood or milled lumber. Okay, back to the garden bed molds. Once solidified after 8 hours, it's time to remove the pipes. I insert a small nail into the hole and pull while rotating back and forth to remove the pipe, and I'm trying to pull the pipe straight out. I have a paper towel ready to wipe the petroleum off the pipe before I set them down. I'll do the same for the rest of the pipes. The petroleum jelly works well and all the pipes came out without any problems. If the surface of the concrete is dry, I'll give it a spray with water before covering with plastic. I will keep the concrete wet and covered for 3 days ideally. The concrete will begin to cure and strengthen during this time. It's important to keep the ambient temperature around 70 degrees for these 3 days or so. If cooler, it will take longer to cure. Too hot and it may dry too quickly and the concrete won't be as strong. After 3 days, in ideal conditions, it's time to release the castings from the molds. I gently pull on the mold to release it from the side walls of the casting. I grip and lift from underneath, then press the top of the mold against the bench while I rotate it over. You don't want to stand a fully loaded mold on the thin plastic flange edge for fear it might crack. Now I gently lift the end of the mold while applying some downward pressure with my other hand. I want to slowly coax the mold off the concrete. Sometimes you'll need to go back and forth from end to end to release it. Once released, have a look inside the cavity. It should look clean with no concrete bits or residue. If it's clean, then the concrete was probably left in the mold long enough. If you find that you're having a hard time unmolding the casting, and you're worried that any more force may damage the plastic, then there's another method that might help. With a hairdryer or heat gun, you can gently warm the plastic evenly to allow it to expand a bit. Be careful not to apply so much heat that it permanently warps or melts the mold. I have my heat gun set on the medium setting and keep it moving over the mold. This should take 1 to 2 minutes. Now the mold should easily release from the concrete. I check that it's just warm to the touch and not hot. Even though this is high-strength concrete, it's only 3 days old, so I handle them gently when moving them aside. I also wear steel-toed safety shoes in case I lose my grip while carrying one of the castings. Here's the rest of the castings coming out of the molds, and they all worked out really well. I did the 24, 36, and the transition size. And for each pair of these, I unmolded the first casting just by hand, then used the warming technique on the second one. This is by far the best part of concrete casting, seeing the final results of all the prep work and mixing. I wrap all these new castings in plastic sheets on the floor of my shop. I wet them with a spray bottle from time to time and leave them to cure over the next 3 weeks. During warm months, you can also bury the castings in wet sand while they cure to full strength. Working indoors allows me to cast these panels any time of the year. Then I can have a bunch ready for making new beds in the spring. I'll take the molds outside and hose them off. I'll give them a scrub with a brush to remove any concrete pieces. Then I'll take the cloth and give the insides a wipe down to remove any final concrete residue. These are then dried and prepped for the next batch. I was cleaning a variety of molds that day. Once cured, I take them outside and set them over sawhorses to dress any sharp edges formed at the top. You can do this by hand with a concrete rub brick that's designed specifically for this purpose, and this is pretty quick and easy. I sometimes use the edge of the rub brick to gently dress the ends around the holes where they will mate with other panels. You can also use a diamond-embedded concrete cutting disc on an angle grinder for dressing the panels. You will need a mask and hearing protection for this, as it makes a load of dust and is very loud. The trade-off is speed. It's a very fast way to treat a large collection of panels. It cuts the sharp edges down very quickly and might take some practice. A light touch at the beginning is recommended. And this is definitely an outdoor activity. I dress one side, then flip the concrete panel over to do the other side. To assemble the garden box, I use a 4-foot spirit level, a framing square, gloves, measuring tape, rubber mallet or small sledgehammer, and a 1/2-inch diameter epoxy-coated rebar. In my garden, I have a spot ready for a new raised bed. I already had a water line in the ground for drip irrigation. With a shovel, I laid out and leveled where the panels would sit. I added some crushed gravel and packed it down. This would give a good surface for the concrete panels to sit on. I use my spirit level here to get the gravel as level as possible. You can also use sand as an alternative. While doing my layout and leveling gravel, I tapped in some rebar to roughly mark the 4 corners of the box. I set my first 2 panels in place and overlapped them at the corners. With a 1-foot-long piece of rebar, I'll pin them together. As I work at positioning the panels, I'm checking for level and square and using the rebar to temporarily keep everything in place. For this bed, I'll use two 36-inch round end panels and four 36-inch transition panels. The outside dimensions will be 36 inches by 5 foot 9.5 inches. The overlap at the end-to-end transition panels takes 2.5 inches off the length of the box. I used the 4-foot spirit level to check that the transition panels were in line with each other. As I was working, I would need to remove or add some gravel to make sure the panels sat level. I used my measuring tape to check that the walls are consistently 36 inches apart as I was setting the third and fourth transition panels. And I'll slide in the final panel for this bed. And a few final checks. Once I had the site prepped and leveled with gravel, this box took me a bit under 15 minutes to assemble. Once I have these 6 panels positioned, I'll tap in the rebar with a hammer. Where the transition panels meet end to end, I'll use 2-foot rebar here. This is to help prevent the panels from moving under the weight of the soil. Later, we'll bring in some topsoil for planting. So I think that's about it. I really like the look of these new rounded garden panels and how they fit with the original existing ones. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them below, and we'll see you in the next one.